Family Moomintroll by Tove Jansson. Chapter 2, read by Sue Swallow. Chapter 2, in which Moomintroll suffers an uncomfortable change and takes his revenge on the antlion, and how Moomintroll and Snufkin go on a secret night expedition. One warm summer day, it was raining softly in the valley of the Moomins, so they all decided to play hide and seek indoors. Sniff stood in the corner of with his nose in his paws and counted up to 10 before he turned round and began hunting. First in the ordinary places and then in the extraordinary ones. Moomintroll lay under the veranda table feeling rather worried. It wasn't a good place. Sniff would be sure to lift the tablecloth and there he would be stuck. He looked about and then he caught sight of the tall black hat which stood in the corner. Do you remember the hobgoblin's hat? That would be a brilliant idea. Sniff would never think of looking under the hat. So Moomintroll stole quietly to the corner and pulled the hat over his head. It didn't reach further than his middle, but if he made himself very small and tucked in his tail, he would be quite invisible. He giggled to himself when he heard the others being found one after the other. The Hemulon had obviously hidden himself under the sofa again. He could never find a better place, and they were all running about searching for Moomintroll. He waited until he was afraid they would get bored with the search, and he crept out of the hat, stuck his head through the door and said, "Look at me!" Sniff stared at him for a long time. Then he said rather unkindly, "Look at yourself." "Who's that?" whispered the Snork, but the others only shook their heads and continued to stare at Moomintroll. Poor little chap. He turned into a very strange animal indeed. Under this hobgoblin's hat, all his fat parts had become thin and everything that was small had grown big. And the strangest thing about it was that he himself didn't realise what was the matter. I thought I'd surprise you all," he said, taking an uncertain step forward on his long, spindly legs. "You've no idea where I've been." "It doesn't interest us," said the Snork, "but you're certainly ugly enough to surprise anybody." "You are unkind," said Moomintroll sadly. "I suppose you got tired of hunting. What shall we do now?" "First of all, perhaps you should introduce yourself," said the Snork Maiden stiffly. "We don't know who you are, do we?" Moomintroll looked at her incredulously, but then it dawned on him perhaps this was a new game. He laughed delightedly and said, "I'm the King of California." "And I am called the Snork Maiden," said the Snork Maiden. "This is my brother." "I'm called Sniff," said Sniff. "I'm Snufkin," said Snufkin. "Oh dear, how boring you all are," said Moomintroll. "Couldn't you think of something more original? Now, let's go out. I think the weather's clearing." And he went down the steps into the garden, followed by a rather surprised and suspicious little trio. "Who's that?" said the Hemulon, who was sitting in front of the house counting the stamens of a sunflower. "It's the King of California, I think," said the Snork Maiden. "Is he going to live here?" said the Hemulon. "Well, that's for Moomintroll to decide," said Sniff. "I wonder where he's got to." Moomintroll laughed. "Oh, you really are quite funny at times. Shall we go and look for Moomintroll?" "You know him," said Snufkin. "Yes," said Moomintroll, "rather well, as a matter of fact." He was thoroughly enjoying the new game and he thought he was doing rather well at it. "How did you come to know him?" said the Snork Maiden. "We were born at the same time," said Moomintroll, still bursting with laughter. "But he's an impossible fellow. You know, you simply can't have him in the house." "How dare you talk about Moomintroll like that?" said the Snork Maiden fiercely. "He's the best Moomin in the world and we think a great deal of him." This was almost really too much for Moomintroll. Really, he said. Personally, I think he's an absolute pest. Go away, said the Snork to Moomintroll. Otherwise, we shall have to sit on your head. All right, all right, Moomintroll said soothingly. It's only a game, isn't it? I'm awfully glad you think so much of me. But we don't, screamed Sniff shrilly. Take away this ugly king who runs down our Moomintroll. And they threw themselves onto poor Moomintroll. He was much too surprised to defend himself, and they shouted at him and they shook their fists at him. And when Moomin Mama came out, he was lying there on the floor, sobbing. What are you doing, children? She cried. Stop squabbling at once. They're walloping the King of California, sniffed the Snork Maiden, and it serves him right. Oh, no. Moomintroll crawled up on his knees, tired and upset. Mother, he said, they started it. 3 against 1, it's not fair. I quite agree, said Moomin Mama seriously. However, I do expect you tease them. But who are you, my little beast? Oh, please stop this awful game, said Moomintroll. It isn't funny anymore. I am Moomintroll and you're my mother, and that's that. You aren't Moomintroll, said the Snork Maiden. He has beautiful little ears, but yours look like kettle holders. Moomintroll felt quite confused and took hold of a pair of enormous crinkly ears. But I am Moomintroll, he burst out in despair. Don't you believe me? Moomintroll has a nice little tail, just about the right size, but yours is like a chimney sweep's brush, said the Snork. And oh dear, it was true. Moomintroll felt behind him with a trembling paw. Your eyes are like soup plates, said Sniff. Moomintrolls are small and kind. Yes, exactly, Snufkin agreed. You are an impostor, said the Hemulon. Isn't there anyone who believes me? Moomintroll pleaded. Oh, look at me carefully, Mother. You must know your own Moomintroll. Moomin Mama looked carefully. She looked into his frightened eyes for a very long time. And then she said quietly, Yes, you are my Moomintroll. And at the same moment, he began to change. His ears, eyes and tail began to shrink, and his nose and tummy, they grew, and until at last he was his old self again. It's all right now, my dear, said Moomin Mama. You see, I shall always know you, whatever happens. A little later on, Moomintroll and the Snork were sitting in one of their secret hiding places under the jasmine bush, which was hidden by a curtain of green leaves. Yes, but you must have done something to change you, the Snork was saying. Moomintroll shook his head. I didn't notice anything unusual, he said, and I didn't say any dangerous words either. Perhaps you stepped into a fairy ring, suggested the Snork. Well, not that I know of, said Moomintroll. I sat the whole time under that black cat that we used as a waste paper basket. In the hat, said the Snork suspiciously. Moomintroll nodded, and they both thought for a long time. Then suddenly they burst out together. It must be! And they stared at each other. Come on, said the Snork. They went up onto the veranda and crept up to the hat very cautiously. It looks rather ordinary, said the Snork, unless you consider that it is a top hat. And that's always somewhat extraordinary, of course. But how can we find out if it was that, said Moomintroll. I'm not going to get into it again. Perhaps we could lure someone else into it, suggested the Snork. Well, but that would be a low-down trick, said Moomintroll. How should we know that he would be all right again? What about an enemy, suggested the Snork. Said Moomintroll. Do you know of one? The pig swine, said the Snork. Moomintroll shook his head. He's too big. Well, the antlion then, suggested Snork. "That's a good idea," said Moomintroll. "He once pulled my mother down into a hole and sprayed sand into her eyes." So they set out to look for the antlion, and they took a big jar with them. You should look for antlion holes in a sandy place, so they wandered down to the beach, and it wasn't long before the Snork discovered a big round hole and signalled eagerly to the Moomintroll. "Here he is," whispered the Snork, "but how shall we lure him into the jar?" "Leave it to me," whispered Moomintroll. He took the jar and he buried it in the sand a little distance away with the opening on the top. Then he said loudly, "These are very weak creatures, these antlions." He signed to the Snork, and they both looked expectantly at the hole. But although the sand moved just a little bit, there was nothing to be seen. "Very weak," repeated Moomintroll. "It takes several hours for them to dig themselves down in the sand, you know." "Yes, but," said the Snork doubtfully. "It does, I tell you," says Moomintroll, making frantic signs with his ears. "Several hours." At that moment, a threatening head with staring eyes popped up from the hole in the sand. "Did you say weak?" said the antlion. "I can dig myself down in exactly 3 seconds. "Well, you really should show us how it's done so we can believe such a wonderful feat as possible," said Moomintroll persuasively. "I shall spray sand on you," replied the antlion very crossly, "and when I've sprayed you down into that hole, I shall gobble you up." "Oh no," pleaded the Snork. "Couldn't you show us how to dig down backwards in 3 seconds instead?" "Do it up here so we can see how better it's done," says Moomintroll, pointing to the spot where the jar was buried. "Do you think I'm going to bother myself with showing tricks to babies?" said the antlion very huffily. But all the same, he couldn't resist the temptation to show them how strong and quick he was. So with scornful sniffings, he scrambled up out of his hole and asked haughtily, "Now, where shall I dig myself in?" "There," said Moomintroll, pointing. The antlion drew up his shoulders and raised his mane in a terrifying way. "Out of my way," he cried. "Now I'm going underground, and when I come back I shall gobble you up. 1, 2, 3. And he backed down into the sand like a whirling propeller, right into the jar which was hidden under him. He certainly only did take 3 seconds, perhaps 2.5, because he was awfully angry. "Quick with the lid," said Moomintroll, and scraping away the sand, they screwed it on very tightly. Then they both heaved up the jar and began to roll it home, with the antlion inside screaming, cursing, choking with sand. "It's frightful how angry he is," said the Snork. "I dared to think what's going to happen when he comes out." "He won't come out now," said Moomintroll quietly. "And when he does, I hope he'll be changed into something horrible." When they arrived at Moomin House, Moomintroll summoned everyone up with 3 long whistles, which means something extraordinary has happened. The others arrived from all directions and collected around the jar with the screw top. "What have you got there?" said Sniff. "An antlion," said Moomintroll proudly. "A genuinely furious antlion that we have taken prisoner." "Fancy you daring," said the Snork Maiden admiringly. "And now I think we'll pour him into the hat," said the Snork. "So that he will be changed like I was," said Moomintroll. "Oh, somebody please tell me what this is all about," said the Hemulan plaintively. "It's because I hid in the hat that I was changed," explained Moomintroll. "We've worked it out now, and we're going to see that if we put the antlion in, he'll turn into something else as well." But he could turn out into absolutely anything," said Sniff. He could turn into something still more dangerous than an antlion and gobble us all up in a minute." They stood in terrified silence, looking at the pot and listening to the muffled sounds coming from inside. "Oh," said the Snork Maiden, turning rather pale. But Snufkin suggested they should all hide under the table while the change took place and put a big book on top of the hat. You must always take risks when experimenting, he said. Tip him in now at once. And I'll come back to part 2 in a little while.